Hey everyone, this is a book review by Christoph Fringeli. The book review is from the Dataside website, dataside-magazine.com. And the book is by a Marcel Bois. The book is titled Kommunisten gegen Hitler und Stalin, die linke Opposition der KPD in der Weimarer Republik, Eine Gesamtdarstellung. Which translates as Communist against Hitler and Stalin, the left opposition of the KPD in the Weimar Republic. It looks like it was published in 2014. And the description on German Amazon says, at the end of the Weimar Republic, the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, was a largely undemocratic and bureaucratic party, the KPD's political line being dictated from Moscow. But that was not always the case. In fact, the KPD underwent a fundamental change over the course of the 1920s. Not all communists accepted this process, known as Stalinization, without protest. Various groups and factions emerged in the left wing of the party that resisted de-democratization and fought for a return to the old KPD. Later, the opposition also campaigned against the increasingly powerful National Socialists. Unlike the KPD leadership, they had recognized very early on the danger that Hitler posed to the German workers' movement. The KPD left had tens of thousands of supporters at times. Among those supporters were well-known party members such as Ruth Fischer, Karl Korsch, Werner Scholem. Nevertheless, they lost the battle of their party, not least because many people found their criticism to be insincere. They themselves played an important role in the de-democratization of the KPD. Using previously unknown sources, Marcel Bois has written the first comprehensive account of the left-wing KPD opposition. Marcel Bois presents almost a dozen different groups, such as the Lenin League, or the previously little researched vetting opposition. Marcel Bois examines their social and organizational history in detail, thus providing a vivid insight into the inner workings of a largely forgotten current of German communism. So here we go. With this 600-page strong book, Marcel Bois offers the first comprehensive overall presentation of the history and sociology of the left opposition of the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, in the 1920s and early 1930s. The emphasis is on a very detailed and scientifically documented depiction of those groups who left the KPD from the mid-20s onward in the course of Stalinization. These were on the one hand the groups around the former leaders of the party such as Ruth Fischer, Arkady Maslow, and Werner Scholem, who, with Hugo Urbahns and others, founded the Leninbund, Lenin League. On the other hand, there were the Entscheidende Linke, decisive left, and the Gruppe Kommunistische Politik around Ernst Schwarz and Karl Korsch respectively, as well as the vetting opposition, and smaller groups like Bolschewistische Einheit, Bolshevik Unity. A bit later, the organizational roots of Trotskyism in Germany also emerged. The Spartacus Bund, Linke Kommunistische Organisationen, around Franz Pfeffer had a special position in the milieu of the left opposition. I'm pretty sure Franz Pfeffer was a, it says Links Kommunistische. Franz Pfeffer I usually associate with the KAPD and those that would go on to become council communists. Anyway, the founding conference of the KPD took place at the turn of the year 1918-1919, within 2 months of the end of World War I. Less than 2 weeks later, two of its most important leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were murdered. There were several attempts from this time through 1923 to make the revolution in Germany happen, which all failed. Already in 1919, a back and forth started between more, quote, left or, quote, right leaning leaderships, and as early as October 1919, a large section of the party's left were expelled. The issues at stake were the rejection of elections to parliament and the Leninist party concept by the left. In April 1920, this left constituted the Communist Workers' Party, the KAPD, Kommunistische Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, and took with them a large part of the membership of the KPD. This marked a decisive historical break in the international communist movement that was echoed in similar processes of regroupment in other countries. Lenin famously targeted the left with Lenin's nasty pamphlet, quote, left-wing communism and infantile disorder, denouncing its, quote, opinion, declamations, and angry ejaculations, end quote, as, quote, childish, quote, particularly stupid, quote, fundamentally wrong, end quote, and amounting to, quote, no more than empty phrase-mongering, end quote. In the process, Lenin defended participation in parliamentary elections and reactionary unions, and effectively the dictatorship of the party over the dictatorship of the proletariat. The KPD, in the meantime, ditched the, quote, right leadership under Paul Levy, who was appalled by the fact that the party had been dragged into the, quote, putschist adventure of the, quote, March action in 1921. If you're curious, Paul Levy was the person who first hid and then released Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution. I think he only released it after he was... I don't know if he's kicked out of the party or just like kicked out of the leadership of the party, but he put it into the open. Yeah, so actually it says that right there. It's like very next sentence. Okay. It says the KPD in the meantime ditched the, quote, right leadership under Paul Levy, who was appalled by the fact that the party had been dragged into the, quote, putschist adventure of the, quote, March action in 1921. Levy then printed the previously unavailable, now famous text by Rosa Luxemburg, in which Rosa Luxemburg severely criticized the Bolsheviks. The party tried to go both ways. On the one hand, participating in elections, on the other, preparing the revolution. However, there was one last ill-fated attempt at a, quote, German October in 1923. Strangely, it was exactly then that the party made another leftward move, sending the previous leaders August Thalheimer and Heinrich Brandler to the Soviet Union, and replacing August Thalheimer and Heinrich Brandler with Ruth Fischer, Arkady Maslow, Werner Scholem, and others. Ironically, they strove to centralize the party more, a process often referred to as Bolshevization. With this, they also inadvertently prepared the organizational ground for the subsequent Stalinization of the party, and their own exclusion and that of many others. Historian Hermann Weber, if you go on Hermann Weber, I have a piece by him. It's kind of like it's a contextualization of the work of Rudolf Barrow and the history of critiques of the USSR from a left-wing perspective. Hermann Weber, I don't know if he's still alive, but when he was alive in Germany, he was like an expert on on the history of East Germany. Seems like a very interesting historian. I'd like to read more of his work. The essay that I read by him is really good. Historian Hermann Weber wrote in Die Wandlung des deutschen Kommunismus. What the hell does that mean? The Transformation of German Communism is the title of the book. Historian Hermann Weber wrote in Die Wandlung des deutschen Kommunismus that the KPD subsequently mutated into a, quote, bureaucratic dictatorial organization which was as far removed from theoretical insights as from revolutionary fire, but caught up in organizational fetishism and new rigid forms of hierarchy, end quote. German historian Hermann Weber. In the Soviet Union, Stalin steadily worked to gain absolute power and presented Stalin's self as Lenin's heir, while at the same time propagating the very un-Lenin-like and generally un-Marxist, in parentheses, quote, theory of, quote, socialism in one country. The socialism in one country model proposed that the isolated Soviet Union would be able to create a socialist society even in the absence of world revolution, which had been seen as the precondition for socialism by all other radical Marxist theorists, including Lenin. But it wasn't just Stalin's lust for power and talent for intrigue that led Stalin to, quote, success, and so many communists to perdition. Stalin was the character mask of a new ruling stratum and the perfect leader for the political and economic organization of the bureaucracy. The Leninist party model was transformed through the act of taking power in a backward country into an authoritarian machine of oppression. Rather than being the, quote, world party of the proletariat, end quote, the Communist International, Comintern, gradually became a tool of Soviet foreign policy. In this spirit, the various parties internationally were subjugated to the line of the Russian Communist Party. Already in Lenin's, quote, left wing, communism, and infantile disorder, Lenin took many outrageous liberties, slamming German, English, and Italian comrades who disagreed with Lenin on tactics and strategies by writing things like, quote, we, parenthesis, sick, exclamation point, and parenthesis, cannot regard as equally ridiculous and childish nonsense the pompous, very learned, and frightfully revolutionary disquisitions, end quote. This became worse under Stalin. It also became clear that the revolution wasn't going to happen anytime soon in Western Europe or North America. In 1925, the new leadership of the KPD under Ernst Thälmann was installed, which was strictly faithful to Stalin. However, the left and, quote, ultra-left were not all expelled simultaneously. Instead, the Central Committee, parenthesis, instructed by the Comintern, end parenthesis, used salami tactics to get rid of the different factions one by one, using the factions' differences to the Central Committee, parenthesis, instructed by the Comintern, end parenthesis, advantage, and trying to play the factions against each other. First to go is a group around the Communist MP Ivan Katz, who denounced the dependency of the KPD on the, quote, petty bourgeois interest of Moscow, end quote, and the, quote, Russian capitalist peasant majority, end quote. Ivan Katz lived from 1889 to 1956 and was a German politician, SPD, USPD, KPD, AAUE, SED, and UAPD. In many ways, the period of Ivan Katz's greatest influence within the Communist Party and after Ivan Katz's expulsion from the Communist Party in 1926 came between 1924 and approximately 1927. Between 1924 and 1928, Ivan Katz served as a member of Parliament, parenthesis, Reichstag Mitglied, end parenthesis. On account of Ivan Katz's record of activism, Ivan Katz was subject to persecution during the 12 Hitler years, spending the years from 1941 to 44 in concentration camps. Ivan Katz, nevertheless survived, became a post-war force in the politics both of Berlin and, until serious heart disease caused his retirement in 1954, in East and West Germany more broadly. Back to the text. This fierce denouncement led the Katz group into an alliance with some of the, quote, first wave of the extreme left who had already left the KPD in 1919, in this case the AAUE and Franz Pfemfert, editor of Die Action, in the Spartakusbund No. 2. The AAUE stood for Allgemeine Arbeiterunion, Einheitsorganisation, General Workers' Union, Unitary Organization, and the AAUE rejected the idea of separation of the party and unions. The new Spartakusbund soon faltered after its initial successes of apparently gaining the support of up to 12,000 members. One crucial point was that Katz didn't want to give up his seat in Parliament, parenthesis, which Ivan Katz held as an independent after getting expelled from the party, in parenthesis, despite the fact that the organization was strictly anti-parliamentarian. A similar fate awaited the next, quote, slice, the Entscheidende Linke, around Karl Korsch, Ernst Schwarz, and others. The linke, split again with one wing around Ernst Schwarz, opting for a decisive break with the KPD and an approach to the KAPD. The Soviet Union was already viewed as state capitalist, and the Entscheidende Linke adopted the anti-parliamentarian position of the KAPD, which led to problems with Schwarz, who, like Katz, still had a seat in the Reichstag. The wing around Karl Korsch called itself Gruppe Kommunistische Politik, adopting the name of the journal they published, and they still hoped to be able to influence comrades in the KPD. Korsch was one of the most important Marxist thinkers of the time. Karl Korsch wrote Marxism and Philosophy, which is widely seen as a key early text of, quote, Western Marxism, along with Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, which both appeared in 1923. While Lukács tried to assimilate to the Stalinist machine, Korsch remained an active Marxist dissident. And again, as what would be suggested, as you might gather, Korsch was a pretty conventional Leninist up to a certain point. If you read I have a pretty long introduction from the book, I think it's Revolutionary Writings, or Karl Korsch's Revolutionary Theory. I'm not sure, but it's a compendium of articles by Karl Korsch, and he in the introduction by Douglas Kellner, who's written a lot of books on like critical theory and things of that sort. He talks about that, how there's kind of idea that Korsch was kind of like always a dissident, but like in the first part of the 1920s, it was a pretty conventional Leninist and held office as for the KPD. So his council communism, which he did come to, came later. Back to the text. Bois then goes into the foundation of the Leninbund, which at first brought together an impressive number of former Central Committee members of the KPD, including the main figures of the left leadership of 1924-25, such as Ruth Fischer, Arkady Maslow, Werner Scholem, Hugo Urbahns, and others. As the name of the organization implies, is strictly Leninist, which demonstrated a difference from the previous two, quote, slices. The other groups were moving away not only from the Stalinized Soviet Union, but also ultimately from Leninism. By contrast, the Leninbund and the other dissidents who left the KPD saw themselves as the, quote, real Leninists, and in their opinion, it was the Russian leadership that was digressing from the, quote, orthodox path. When the Leninbund decided to stand in elections, the Leninbund caused the standing in the election caused the organization to break apart. Since many of them still dreamed of recapturing the KPD and thus opposed running candidates against the KPD, Scholem, Fischer, and Maslow left the Leninbund. The election results were poor and the organization was weakened. Yeah, that's interesting that the Leninbund decided to stand in elections because, and that kind of, I think that kind of probably explains at least part of probably the break with Hugo Urbahns with Trotsky, if he was part of the Leninbund, because in this point, until the rise to the power of the Nazis, Trotsky and the international left opposition viewed themselves as the left wing of the Comintern and the left wing of the Communist Party Soviet Union. They were fundamentally like what you might call like reform communists. If they were, allowed to be back into the Communist Party Soviet Union, then they could fix the problems initiated by Stalin and the bureaucracy and so forth. So they weren't an independent. Trotskyism doesn't become like an independent movement of the Comintern until 1933. So, carrying on. At the same time, the left opposition in the Soviet Union distanced themselves from their international allies as a condition to be allowed to remain in the party there. This was orchestrated by the Stalin leadership to weaken the opposition internally, and Zinoviev and Trotsky fell for it, even if for only a short time. Another problem was that the KPD embarked on an ostensibly, quote, left course from 1928-29 onwards. After, they also expelled the oppositional, quote, right around August Thalheimer and Heinrich Brandler, who went on to form their own party, the KPD Opposition, or KPO. Thalheimer and Brandler were the last independent thinkers, and indeed the last Marxist theoreticians who deserved that name who were expelled. The KPD was then servile to Stalin's line, leading it to disaster and collapse in the face of the Nazi takeover. In this last phase before complete Stalinization, 1928 to 1930, Bois goes into great detail about some currents that had previously been largely overlooked, like the vetting opposition, named after the Berlin working class district, but which also had sections in other parts of the country. Bois then discusses the early years of Trotskyism in Germany, which is a movement that stayed quite small compared to other left oppositionist groups and didn't fail to split in two. It was also subject to infiltration by the GPU, the Russian Secret Service, within a short time. All of these accounts are very readable and thoroughly researched, which definitely makes Bois' book a must for anyone interested in the process of the degeneration of the communist movement in the second half of the 20s. Although Bois follows Hermann Weber's groundbreaking work, Die Wandlung des deutschen Kommunismus, the transformation of German communism, from 1969 in many ways, Marcel Bois does manage to map out some blank spots of the left opposition and add many details. This is reinforced by the solid sociological basis Bois describes in the last part of the book, parenthesis, which is perhaps a bit more boring to read, end parenthesis, but almost more importantly, by two excursuses. The first looks into the relationship between Leon Trotsky and Alexandra Pfemfert-Rahm, who was his German translator, and her husband, Franz Pfemfert, the editor of Die Action, and a key figure of the Weimar ultraleft. The second investigates the parenthesis non-relationship and parenthesis, the parenthesis non and parenthesis relationship between Trotsky and August Thalheimer, particularly regarding their fascism theories. This also shows that the author's focus is on the tendencies corresponding to the left opposition in the Soviet Union, at first more Zinovievist, then more Trotskyite. This is fair enough, as it is indeed the subject of Bois' research, as the subtitle of the book shows. However, by calling the opposition, quote, left communist, end quote, throughout much of the book a problem is created, specifically the distinction between the left opposition and the, quote, other communist left, namely the anti-Leninist tradition, starting with the already mentioned break of the KAPD from the KPD. Generally, there is no agreed terminology in the wider literature on the topic, and it remains somewhat unclear what is meant by terms like left communist, ultra-left, left communist, or left opposition. Bois', quote, solution is to call the KAPD, etc., quote, left radical, end quote, which at least echoes Lenin's discriminatory invectives. Therefore, the KAPD's spin-offs, and wider milieu don't play a significant role in Bois' narrative except where they come into contact with the various KPD oppositions. To some degree, that is an understandable decision, as the specific aim of Bois' book is to chronicle in detail the various oppositions within the KPD after Lenin's death. They generally didn't renounce Leninism. On the contrary, they mostly saw themselves as the true Leninists in contrast to the party, which they saw as abandoning the party's Bolshevik heritage. However, this hadn't been the case with the, quote, first generation left communists organized in the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, KAPD, and other more council communist organizations, AAU, AAUE, etc. While initially they saw themselves as part of the one world communist movement and tried to become members of the Comintern, they soon rejected the established tenets of the, quote, official movement. Then they analyzed the Soviet Union as, quote, state capitalist, and its press denounced the Soviet Union's efforts to start economic, political, and military collaborations with capitalist countries, including common maneuvers of the Red Army with the Reichswehr. Nevertheless, they consider themselves and should be seen as and treated as communist. The fact that the most intelligent heads of the communist movement ended up in small organizations is telling as well. We can conclude that there was no longer any space for real Marxist theory in the large organizations, parenthesis, the KPD in this case, end parenthesis, as soon as these parties became the concrete political administrators for the interests of a particular stratum. The Communist Party was no longer the expression of the world proletariat as the executor of the world revolution whose aim was to abolish all classes, but instead became the agency of the new ruling stratum of the bureaucracy in the USSR. The party itself was a huge bureaucracy of wannabe rulers, which people who survived the Stalinist purges partially realized in the form of the DDR after the war, East Germany. In the post-war years, the historiography of the Eastern Bloc attempted to rewrite the history of the communist movement by blocking out whole sections, touching up others, and generally falsifying and distorting it, sometimes beyond recognition. Trotsky and the old guard of the Bolsheviks, who were massacred by Stalin and Stalin's henchmen, are only the most famous victims of this gross falsification. The same applies to all the smaller and more marginalized groups and individuals. At the same time, in the West, there was little interest in presenting a narrative that indeed there had been many communists opposing Lenin, and, parenthesis, many more opposing, end parenthesis, Stalin. Both sides in the Cold War profited from the objectively wrong view that Stalinism equals communism, when in reality it was a new form of counter-revolution. It wasn't in the supposedly communist East, but instead in West Germany, where it was possible for some of the radical groups that claimed lineage from the communist left of the 1920s, as well as from the dissident, quote, right, KPO, parenthesis, in the form of the Gruppe Arbeiterpolitik, which still exists today, end parenthesis, to continue their work. In the, quote, anti-authoritarian, end quote, phase of the 60s protest movement, many of these dissident strains were unearthed and their rich heritage was appreciated for the first time. In the context of historiography, it was the University of Marburg, where from the late 60s onwards a number of monographs were written, mostly in the form of doctoral theses, dealing with various dissident strains of communism. After a certain lull in the following decades, there seems to be a resurgence of interest and research, helped by the fact that after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, new archival materials have become available. Marcel Bois' book is a welcome contribution to this archaeology of resistance. The end. Thank you for listening.